Thank you for joining me for the Lifeway study of Ezekiel and Daniel. This is session 7. The title is Values, and our text is Ezekiel 16, verses 20 to 21, and Ezekiel 23, verse 36 to 39, and Psalm 139, verses 13 to 16. The lesson summary statement is God values all human life. Over 21 years have passed since 9/11. And on that day, everyone can remember where they were. And so where were you when you heard the news about 9/11? And I'll solicit that from the class. And then I'll point out there were almost 3,000 people who died on that day on 9/11. But there are over 3,000 people who die every day because of abortion. And so every day in America since 1973, we have had a 9/11 in terms of the deaths of unborn babies. They estimate that the total since 1973 is over 60 million unborn babies have been aborted. The passage from Ezekiel and Psalms are bound together by this central truth that God values all human life. And in each passage that's here, God reminds His people that humans are created in His image, and therefore all people, unborn babies, the elderly, the disabled, the mentally challenged, the mentally ill, the chronically ill, all races, all people are to be treated as valued by God. The Ezekiel passages reveal that God's people have a habit of following their neighbors, and their neighbors did not value human life. So the first title of our lesson is Wrongdoing is Justified. Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 20 to 21. Now this is one of the longest chapters in the Bible. It is a parable about an adulterous wife. And he's telling the story of Israel and their engagement with foreign nations. And he uses a very powerful picture. He starts off with a child that is abhorred and cast aside, and it doesn't receive the normal procedures of a child that is born, of being wrapped and cared for and cleaned and washed in and salt so that the germs would die. And this baby is just simply abandoned. And he adopts this child and raises this child. Because of his love for the child becomes a beautiful woman, and the picture changes, and God marries this child, and it becomes his wife. But this child is not a faithful wife. In verse 15, the word "but" starts that verse, and what we see is this child that's been shown so much grace and been given so much love becomes an adulterous woman. Because of amnesia, she has forgotten the one that loved her. And this chapter, in the middle of it, in the passages that we're looking at, is this nation, pictured as this woman, takes all the blessings that God has given them and offers them in worship to an idol. And one of those things that it offers in worship to an idol is the sacrifice of their children to these pagan gods. And so I would read the text, verses 20 to 21, and then after that I ask, who does Ezekiel say these children belong to? And you'll notice, you even took your sons and daughters you bore to me and sacrificed them to these images as food. Wasn't your prostitution enough? You slaughtered my children and gave them up when you passed them through the fire to the images. In other words, these children are God's children. Did you know that it's been 40 years since Prince Charles and Princess Diane's wedding, and you can purchase a slice of their wedding cake? An American recently purchased a slice of the wedding cake of Prince Charles and Princess Diana's wedding. Cost him $700. Now, why in the world would someone pay $700 for a slice of wedding cake? Well, of course, the answer that I'm looking for is because it's who it is associated with. The person it's associated with is what gives it value. And these children are God's children, and they are of great and inestimable value. The practice of child sacrifice was brutal. In some practices, the child would be killed, and then the child would be offered in a fire as a sacrifice. The god of Moloch had these bronze arms that stood out like this, and the child would be placed upon that. The bronze would be heated to a fiery red, and then the child would be placed on that. Mercifully, the child would be dead. But there are other practices of child sacrifice where a child is placed into a box, a metal box, and then the drums are beaten loudly so that it drowns out the cries of the baby. It is unbelievable. It's hard to imagine that human beings could have such a hard heart towards their children. Why would they do that? Well, they would sacrifice their most precious thing in order to persuade the god to give them fruitful crops, so that they would be prosperous, so that they wouldn't starve. And interestingly enough, they also did this so that the gods would give them more children, because children were a form of security in that day and time. Now, what possible logic could parents use to justify sacrificing their child to a pagan god? What were they thinking as to why they would take this beautiful child and sacrifice it? And the things that I'm driving at in these questions and this discussion is I'm wanting people to see that the reasons they were doing those things back then had an economic basis to it. They wanted prosperity, and they were looking for convenience, and they were looking for security. And as a result of that, they devalued these precious children that were given to them. Now, there's an article entitled, "Why Women Abort." I found this on the internet, and it is at hli.org, resources, Why Women Abort, if you should be interested in it. And it has this statement in it: a survey of more than 2.4 million aborting women performed by the states of Florida, Louisiana, Minnesota, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Utah during the years 1996 to 2020 gives us an accurate estimate of the number of hard case abortions, since these are the numbers that abortion clinics must report in official documents in these states. So I'm going to ask the class, what do you suppose the percentage of abortions were in which it was done in order to save the life or the physical health of the mother? What percentage? And get a few guesses. And the percentage that they give in this article is 1.14% of abortions were performed to save the life or the health of the mother. How about in cases of rape or incest? That's something that people talk about as well. What percentage of those abortions were done and the case was rape or incest? Again, I'll ask for responses. The percentage was 0.39%. 0.39%. What about for fetal defects, birth defects, or eugenics? That is, there's something about the child they didn't want. Maybe it was a male and they wanted a female, or something of that nature. Eugenics. What percentage of abortions were performed because of that? And the answer is 0.69%. That means when you take all of the other categories, total them all together, 96.5% of all abortions performed in these states during that time period, 1996 to 2020, were performed for social or economic reasons. Even the Guttmacher Institute puts the abortions done for the hard cases under 7% after doing several surveys of women obtaining abortions. Now, the Guttmacher Institute, it is the research arm of Planned Parenthood of America. It's considered one of the most reliable providers for accurate statistics on abortion. The point I'm trying to drive at is, in the days of Ezekiel, people were making decisions based on economic or social concerns, and it is still the same thing today. by and large, 96.5% of the time, the real reason for the taking of a baby's life in its mother's womb is because of economic or social concerns. This is a powerful illustration of how all kinds of wrongdoing is justified. Do you see that title? Wrongdoing is justified. And this is why they were doing this. The second point of this lesson is callousness becomes the norm. And again, chapter 23 is an allegorical parable similar to chapter 16. Chapter 16 was focusing on idolatry, but in chapter 23, it's focusing on the political alliances that the nation has been making in order to find its security and that kind of thing. And he uses these two sisters named Aholah and Aholibah. And so I would just read through the text and then turn to page 68 in the Personal Study Guide. And on page 68 in the Student's Personal Study Guide, the next to the last paragraph, the very last sentence says, over time, people can become so calloused by their sin that they no longer reveal God's holiness. And so we didn't immediately get to the point where 1 out of every 4 or 1 out of every 3 pregnancies ends in abortion in the United States. The most dangerous place in America is not in some of the inner cities of our largest cities. The most dangerous place in America today is not on a battlefield. The most dangerous place in America is to be in your mother's womb. Now, we didn't get there overnight. Women had to be conditioned to accept the idea of taking their child's life. There was a callousness that began to be developed. So in light of that, there's a question on page 69 in the Personal Study Guide I'd like for the class to deal with. What safeguards might a person put in place to keep from becoming calloused towards sin? And I also want to explore the idea, how did we get to this place? What took place so that so many American women and their husbands or their boyfriend would actually be willing to take the life of a child? How did we get here? And then what are the safeguards that a person might put in place? I came across an article by John Piper entitled 13 Practical Steps to Kill Sin. It's found on his website, Desiring God. And after the class has responded to this question, what safeguards might be put in place, I'm going to share a few of the things that John Piper has in that article. And they may have very well touched on some of them as well in terms of their suggestions. But here's just a few that he gives. Number 1, cultivate enmity towards sin. You don't kill friends. He says you kill enemies. Ponder how sin killed your best friend. Imagine how it dishonors your father and aims to destroy you forever. Develop more of a hatred for sin. I don't have any problems rejecting alcohol because of experiences and what I've seen in the ministry of its consequences. I hate alcohol. And so because of that, I don't have any interest in it at all. And so he's saying cultivate an enmity with sin. Secondly, don't make plans to open the door for sin's entry. I remember a preacher saying one time, if you don't want to fall, don't walk in slippery places. And so don't go to places, don't be around people that tempt you into sin. Many years ago, my wife and I had the privilege of leading this woman to faith in Christ. She came to church faithfully, but then she began to be involved with her old friends who enjoyed going to the clubs to dance and drink. And when she shared that with us, we cautioned her about it, but she said, well, I'm going to be a witness. I don't drink. I want to show them that you can have fun and not drink. But before long, we lost her to that crowd because she opened herself up to that kind of temptation. Number 3, admit and confess all known sin every day. Just doing that is a powerful way to deal with this callousness that happens in sin. I mean, if you get to saying every day, "Dear God, forgive me, I'm a liar," at some point or another, you're going to be tired of saying that, and you're going to begin to make an effort to tell the truth. Every day, admit and confess all known sin. Number 4, develop mental habits that continually renew the mind in God-centeredness. Develop mental habits that continually renew the mind in God-centeredness. Philippians 4:8 says, "Think on these things, whatsoever pure and noble and good and honorable." This is what he's talking about. And number 5, suggestion from John Piper, is be accountable to a small group. One of the good things you can do in your class for the spiritual health of your class is develop some kind of a outreach ministry in which you stay in touch with the members. And when they're missing, someone calls and someone writes and contacts them and lets them know that they were missed, and find out if there's something that can be prayed for them. Just that kind of accountability has a powerful impact on people's lives. And so don't diminish that kind of ministry. Find a way to cultivate that in your class. So there's this point of callousness because it becomes the norm. And then the last point is God's truth is revealed. Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16. And what I'm asking when I ask someone to read through this, or I read through it, is what is this revealing to us about God, and what is it revealing to us about people? In verse 13 it says, "For it was you who created my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb." The word inward parts talks about that place where we're sensitive to what's right and wrong. It's literally kidneys. So when they would disembowel an animal, the last organs that they would remove would be the kidneys. And so they considered that the inward parts. And this is the part where you feel and think and make decisions. And so he's talking about, "For it was you who made me deep within myself." You know me that deeply. And then he uses this term of a weaver knitting together his life. And so his own personal life is fashioned. Every part of his life, his personality, his mind, his intelligence, all of that has the fingerprints of God upon it. In verse 14, "I will praise you because I have been remarkably and wondrously made. Your works are wondrous, and I know this very well." This is written in the original language where it's practically ecstatic. He is overwhelmed by God's handicraft of his life in the womb. And then verse 15, "My bones were not hidden from you when I was made in secret, when I was formed in the depths of the earth." He uses that as a picture to talk about the mother's womb. And he said God saw him being formed. "Your eyes saw me when I was formless." He's talking about an undeveloped embryo. "All my days were written in your book and planned before a single one of them began." God had a purpose for this. Now, before even his mother knew that he was being carried by her, even before she knew, God knew. And God saw him as a person, as someone that was creative and tremendously inspiring. Now, this psalm talks about God's involvement in our life. In verses 1 to 6, he states God knows all. In verses 7 to 12, he said God is everywhere. And then in verses 13 through 18, he said God is all-powerful. So God knows all. He's ever-present. He's all-powerful. And then verse 19 to 24, he says this all-knowing, ever-present, all-powerful God, he's the only one who's capable of judging rightly. And what is his judgment about human beings? They are awe-inspiring creatures. It's one thing to create a monkey. It's another thing to create a mango. But it is on an altogether different level to create a human being. And that's what he's stressing here. He is stressing that God's truth reveals the value, the uniqueness of this human being. All human life is valuable and should be protected. That's the thrust of this lesson. Now, to conclude the lesson, I went to the Go Explore the site, and it has an article about Bill Russell, the basketball player. And some of your folks may remember that, and some may not. Maybe you could find another example that would be more meaningful to your class who would know it. But Bill Russell played in the National Basketball Association from 1956 to 1969, and talks about him auctioning off some of his memorabilia, and it was things like a jersey and championship rings and those kinds of things. The top 18 items alone netted $5.3 million, and his rookie Topps basketball card went for $76,000. Altogether, this totaled $7.4 million. And we're talking about jerseys and rings and basketball cards. Why was it so valuable? Because it was Bill Russell. People will pay for what they value. What keeps us from treating every person as if they were a respected sports champion? What keeps us from treating every person as if they were a respected sports champion? Because the teaching of Scripture is very clear. God values all human life. And that is to be our response to it as well. The point of the lesson is to see people through God's eyes. And again, to close the lesson, I'm going to take them to the conclusion of their personal study guide on page 72 and just point out that at the top is a summary statement of these points, each point. And then there are these 3 sections in bold lettering where they can apply the lesson. And I want to just simply ask them the last question. As a group, discuss needs in your community for demonstrating that all people are valued. How can your group help meet some of those needs? One of the things I'm going to mention is an elementary school that we work with. They're always needing people to be mentors, to come and just sit with a child, let the child read to them, or maybe help with them with some homework. And I've done that before. It takes an hour out of your day, and at the most, and it's just a wonderful way to invest in a person. The child that I worked with was a boy named Knowledge. Isn't that interesting? And so there may be other things in your community and our community that would be ways in which our class could make an impact. We had one class that used to buy toiletries and food items, food items for students who, for whatever reasons, couldn't live at home anymore. They were in high school, and they had a place for them to live, and you could supply them with toothbrushes and toothpaste and quick fix food items and those kind of. We had a Sunday school class that did that. So there may be things like that that maybe your class could participate in and help people in your community. God bless you. Thank you for teaching God's Word.